Dear friends of HRNK, thank you so much for joining us today. No retreat, no surrender. Bruce Springsteen. This is David Hawk's favorite tune. He's a huge Bruce Springsteen fan, very applicable to our own North Korean human rights movement. This is a very momentous day in the history of HRNK. 2021 is our 20th Jubilee year. We were established in 2001. Our first report, Hidden Gulag, by David Hawk, published in 2003, set the standard for investigations of North Korea's vast system of political imprisonment. It is very meaningful that HRNK's report number 50, Human Rights in the DPRK, the role of the United Nations by none other than David Hawk, is being released today. Thank you, David. David Hawk doesn't need an introduction. You all know him. Most of our friends and supporters have been following HRNK and North Korean human rights. David Hawk has been a standard setter for investigations of the North Korean human rights situation for the past 2 decades. This is David's 6th report with HRNK and a true opus magnum that will surely be the cornerstone of our outreach to UN agencies, UN permanent missions, as well as like-minded states and governments. In particular, our EU friends and partners in HRNK has tried very thoroughly to reinforce those transatlantic connections under COVID. Of course, this is a topic for the future. Again, David's career spans many decades, and the very young David Hawk was very deeply involved with the civil rights movement here in the United States. He has addressed some of the world's worst human rights violations, the Cambodian genocide. He has also, of course, once again, been a standard bearer on this particular issue of North Korean human rights. David, thank you so much for doing this, and thank you for being always so active at the forefront of research and investigation of this very important topic. I am going to turn it over to you before I introduce our distinguished panelists and before I turn it over to them for the discussion. So, David, please go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you for that generous introduction. The United Nations is important, particularly important for promoting human rights in North Korea for 2 reasons. The first of which is that North Korea is so self-isolated and closed up that the normal ways of promoting and protecting human rights in almost all other UN member states is not possible in North Korea. There probably are many North Koreans who would like to enjoy more freedoms and who would like to participate in promoting human rights in North Korea, but they're not able to. So because you can't engage in the normal kind of human rights promotion activities, both North Koreans in North Korea and the human rights, the global human rights movement outside North Korea can't work the way we normally work in almost all other countries. The second reason, therefore, we have greater recourse to the United Nations than is usually the case. Secondly, the UN is important for the reasons that Ambassador King explained in his recent book. North Korea claims that human rights is a racket kicked up by hostile US policy and the US puppet states. but the activities at the UN show that the concern for human rights in North Korea is a subject supported by huge majority of governments at the United Nations. And in fact, as the North Koreans diplomats know full well, the leadership on human rights at the UN has primarily come from the Europeans. So the UN is important for these reasons. This report looks at the interaction between North Korea and the United Nations in the field of human rights going back several decades. There are two chapters on North Korea, one of which is on the headwinds against human rights promotion and protection that come out of the monolithic ideology the North Koreans call Kim Il-sungism, which makes it particularly hard to promote human rights in North Korea. Another chapter notes the changes in North Korean society and political economy since the turn of the millennium. Changes that we hope will facilitate some improvement in human rights in the long term, and that perhaps can interface with some of the progress that has been made on human rights issues at the United Nations. So the report traces the activities to promote and protect human rights in North Korea through the variety of UN organs, agencies, committees, programs, and projects. It starts off with an overview of the 4 historical phases of interaction between North Korea and the UN. The first phase was from 1980 to 2003, when the only human rights issues being raised were those related to North Korean ratification of several of the international human rights conventions and their participation or non-participation in the Treaty Implementation Review Committee process. And during those 2 decades, mostly you had North Korea's involvement was sort of lackadaisical to adamant renunciations. At one point in the late 1990s, the North Koreans asserted that they unratified the international covenant related to civil and political rights. The UN then told them that, well, actually, there's no, unlike trade agreements and arms control agreements, which have a withdrawal provision, there's no provision in the International Human Rights Convention for withdrawal. Once a state has ratified a convention, those rights belong to the territory and the people within the territory. So for a while, North Korea, one more time, participated, but again, more recently has announced their renunciation of the ratification. At the time in the mid-late 90s, during the North Korean famine, it was realized that these issues, which took place mostly in Geneva, weren't really related to the enormous reality on the ground in North Korea caused by the famine and the enormous refugee outflow in the mid to late 1990s. So it was thought that the deliberations in Geneva weren't dealing with the real situation of human rights. So the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly became involved in considering the situation of human rights in the DPRK. And the report describes how and why the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly took up the issues of the situation of human rights in the DPRK. That led for a decade of truculent non-cooperation between North Korea and the United Nations. The North Koreans simply refused any cooperation with the Human Rights Council, with the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for the Special Rapporteur, for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and their programs. They even, in the midst of the famine, refused 6 requests from the Special Rapporteur on the right to food for a dialogue about this issue at a time when the UN was supplying food and humanitarian assistance to almost 1/3 of the North Korean population. And the North Koreans were the only UN member state to decline participation in the crucial phase of a UN program called the Universal Periodic Review. At the time when North Korea was adamantly, truculently refusing cooperation with the UN, their political line was that all the human rights posited by the UN and the international conventions were fully enjoyed by their citizenry, and that there could be no human rights problem or issue in their people-centered socialism. That's what they said. They said it formally. That's what their diplomats said in the corridors. In 2013, because of the huge increase in the information about the human rights situation that came from ever larger numbers of refugees fleeing, and because of their non-cooperation, the member states, led again by the European Union, decided that the measures taken so far weren't getting anywhere, and they decided to undertake the most powerful, highest level investigation that the UN can undertake, which is called the Commissions of Inquiry. In 2013, the Commission of Inquiry was impaneled, and its mandate was to determine if any of the gross violations of internationally recognized human rights documented in a decade's worth of reports from the special rapporteurs constituted crimes against humanity. And the how and why the Commission of Inquiry came about, how it worked, what it found, what it recommended, is detailed in the present report. When it was issued, the language of the international community in response to the COI report changed from deep concern, quote unquote, to condemnation in the strongest possible terms. And the Human Rights Council and General Assembly recommended that the Security Council refer North Korea to the International Criminal Court. The North Koreans responded to this in a variety of ways that are described in this report. But among those was a change in the North Korean political approach and political line toward the human rights situation in the DPRK and toward the various UN programs to promote and protect human rights. And the North Koreans had or undertook a number of tactical openings to cooperate with the promotion and protection of human rights. And those tactical openings are described in the report. They're highly circumscribed, and their limitations are discussed, but they also do now open up a range of possibilities for moving ahead on human rights in the future. All of the UN programs, mechanisms result in recommendations. The Human Rights Committee, the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, the implementation review committees for the conventions, the special rapporteurs, all make recommendations to the DPRK as to how to improve the human rights situation. And the report takes a look at the remarkable consistency of the recommendations made to North Korea over the course of several decades. But in the new post-COI situation, what the North Koreans have done essentially is accepted on paper and in principle a substantial number of these recommendations. So they now engage in human rights discourse, and on paper and on principle, they're open to some very interesting measures. Now, and the report details what those tactical openings are. The human rights advocates can differ as to how much they all add up to, what might be accomplished if you can move ahead on this. This can and will be and continue to be debated in human rights circles. But there's something else more important to start off with, which is that the UN has advanced a two-track approach to promoting and protecting human rights in North Korea. What they call the accountability track and what they call the engagement track. At the present time, both of these tracks, both of these approaches are stymied. The engagement track is really stymied in part because of the extraordinary closures that North Korea has imposed on itself due to the COVID pandemic. Closures that exceed any of the UN or US sanctions tried to do. The North Koreans have voluntarily closed their borders and closed their society even more, even beyond the COVID enclosures. The North Koreans have been battening down the hatches, tightening down the screws. I believe it is in large measure because of the popularity of South Korean media and culture within North Korea. So they've tightened up considerably on allowing South Korean music or South Korean movies or TV dramas to circulate. There are arresting people who are caught with this. They are tightening down on the use of cell phones, etc. And because of COVID, humanitarian aid is now completely at a standstill. It's very nice for the North Koreans to have agreed in principle on paper for the UN agencies to now conduct human rights education and training programs inside North Korea, but there aren't any international UN staff in North Korea at the present time, and most of the NGO humanitarian aid workers have been withdrawn. A large portion of the diplomatic corps has also been withdrawn, and these people can't go back, and we don't know when they'll be able to go back. So anything related to the possibility of engagement with North Korea for humanitarian aid or human rights promotion is, for the moment, completely stymied. The other track is also stymied, the accountability track. The furthest that international law and procedure and the furthest that global politics allow the accountability process to proceed for North Korea is for there to be discussions of the situation of human rights in the DPRK at the UN Security Council. That's very rare for the Security Council to discuss human rights situations. It has to be judged that the level of human rights the human rights situation is sufficiently serious to challenge international peace and security. Following the Commission of Inquiry report for 4 years, in 2014, 15, 16, 17, there were discussions at the UN's, discussions of the North Korean human rights situation at the UN Security Council. There haven't been any since 2017 because the Human Rights Coalition at the United Nations basically fell apart. Japan temporarily withdrew. They're back, but they withdrew for a time because I believe they wanted to join the summit diplomacy that was going on in 2018, 19, and 20. South Korea withdrew from the Human Rights Coalition at the UN. For the first year of the current Moon administration, the foreign ministry announced that South Korea would continue to support human rights measures at the international community, but the foreign ministry was overruled by the Blue House, and I don't think that's likely to change at all as long as the progressives control the executive branch and the legislature in South Korea. But what also happened was that the US withdrew from the Human Rights Coalition at the UN. The United States, during the Trump administration, withdrew from the Human Rights Council. And unlike 2014 and 15 and 16, when Secretary of State Kerry and the US ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, were very active in working to have the discussion at the Security Council. That continued in the first year of the Trump administration, I think because of the political standing and independence of US Ambassador Nikki Haley. But I think after that, the influence of National Security Council John Bolton came to bear, and the US withdrew its support for discussion of North Korean human rights at the Security Council. Now, so one of the things, while we can't move ahead on the engagement front until there's some solution to the COVID issue, and then re-engagement all has to be renegotiated essentially, and we don't know if those negotiations will get far enough along to include human rights provisions. However, so it's not possible for the immediate future to move very far ahead on engagement. I think it is possible to move ahead on the accountability track. President Biden has announced that the US is back. We hope that will mean that Ambassador King's successor will be named, and that this fall, this autumn, the US will do what it needs to do in order to help secure discussion at the Security Council this year. So let me stop there. These are the sort of subjects that are discussed in detail in this report. I'm sorry, it's not a page turner. It's pretty dense. A lot of this stuff is complicated. There are a lot of footnotes and a lot of procedures that have to be gone through. But there's a lot of stuff in there in this report that points in the direction that I hope the international community and the North Koreans will be able to take in the future. Back to you, Greg.
Thank you so much, David. It's an extraordinary report, a great account of UN interaction with DPRK. It should be at the top of the list of every student of North Korean human rights, together with Ambassador King's book, which we featured last week, together with everything that our co-chair Emeritus Roberta Cohen has written on North Korean human rights. Let me take this opportunity to welcome our co-vice chair of the board, Suzanne Schulte, who has joined this program. Also Melanie Kirkpatrick, author of The Underground Railroad. Also Dr. Cortland Robinson, author of another seminal HRNK report. Before I turn it over to Dr. Cohen, let me tell the participants that once we are done with the discussion, I will invite you to ask questions via the chat function or the Q&A function. Please feel free to submit questions even while the discussion's ongoing. That said, let me introduce our first discussant, HRNK co-chair emeritus Roberta Cohen, who has been a very prolific writer on North Korean human rights and a thought leader on this issue for the past 2 decades. Of course, Roberta has done very meaningful work with the United Nations. She's credited for having internationalized the issue of internally displaced persons, IDPs. Roberta is also a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Rights at the U.S. State Department. We're always thankful for her leadership and guidance on issues pertaining to North Korean human rights. Roberta, I'm going to turn it over to you.
To unmute myself there. Sorry, I have to unmute myself. Thank you, and it's really good to hear. This is HRNK's 50th report. Congratulations, and good morning to everyone. Being on a program with David Hawk is a special pleasure. 44 years ago, our pictures were together in the New York Times as pioneers in the then emerging international human rights movement. Among the lessons we both learned is staying power, which is especially relevant to North Korea, where crimes against humanity have been state policies for decades. The United Nations, as David Hawk has pointed out, has been the most significant forum for bringing North Korea's human rights situation to world attention. The 2014 Commission of Inquiry, chaired by Justice Michael Kirby, produced by far the most well-documented and thorough account of the broad range of crimes committed by the North Korean government. And its report called for both accountability and efforts at engagement with North Korea. David Hawk's new report greatly enhances our understanding of the UN role, its significance given North Korea's closed society, and the tensions between international norms and the ideology, the monolithic ideology of the Workers' Party. I would recommend the reports being forwarded to the North Korean missions to the UN in New York and Geneva, as well as to all UN country missions. And that's because the report is filled with constructive ideas for moving human rights forward and reconciling UN standards and recommendations with North Korea's responses. Of course, David has pointed out in the last few years of the COVID and the impact it's had on North Korea, it's rather stymied many of these recommendations, but nonetheless, we'll go through them because I think that in time, we will be turning to this very useful set of ideas in David's report. So let's look at a few ways highlighted in the report that could lead to movement forward. First, in the area of legal reform. North Korea's accession to 5 international human rights treaties has resulted in some changes in North Korea's laws, especially concerning the rights of women, children, and the disabled. But detention laws have also undergone some revision. For example, shortening pre-trial detention and restricting nighttime interrogations. What is lacking is acknowledgement of these revisions to its population and enforcement mechanisms. But it's nonetheless conceivable that some North Koreans have benefited from these changes. In the UN strategic framework with the DPRK, that's the agreement with North Korea governing UN operations on the ground, UN agencies offer to provide support to the government in meeting its human rights commitments under UN treaties and the UN's Universal Periodic Review. What bears watching once the situation normalizes, and we don't know when that will be, is the extent to which the UN resident coordinator and the humanitarian agencies on the ground try to implement this offer to move human rights forward through legal reform. And will the UN Secretary General's office and member states back up the country team in this effort? Second, in the area of human rights technical assistance and training, for many years, North Korea rejected offers made by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to provide technical assistance, which means working together to incorporate human rights standards into laws and policies, establish a national human rights institution, or introduce human rights education and training. However, in 2019, North Korean officials participated in a 3-day workshop in Geneva organized by the High Commissioner's office to train them in responding to the Universal Periodic Review. North Korea also agreed to the language in the UN Strategic Framework, which says that to ensure improved compliance with human rights, UN agencies in North Korea may support dialogue, technical cooperation, and training in international standards. This gives an opening to the UN to develop technical assistance and training programs. There are unconfirmed reports that North Korea has provided training to its security and police officials to improve treatment of prisoners. If so, UN involvement would be most critical here. Third, visits from UN human rights rapporteurs. North Korea, since 2004, has refused to invite for a visit the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the DPRK, and even told the current rapporteur that he would be welcome as a law professor from Argentina, but not as the Special Rapporteur. However, North Korea did extend an invitation to the UN Rapporteur on Disabilities, who visited in 2017 and made a series of useful recommendations. How can North Korea be encouraged to implement those recommendations and also invite other rapporteurs to visit? The ones on food, on water and sanitation, on freedom of religion have all requested a visit. The Special Rapporteur on Human Rights has proposed that a binding agreement be negotiated with North Korea in the course of future peace talks to require it to cooperate with the UN and grant access to independent human rights monitoring. Fourth, participation in the Universal Periodic Review. For the first time in 2014, as David recalled, North Korea began to accept recommendations of other UN member states to improve its human rights record. As might be expected, it rejected recommendations about the violations that constitute crimes against humanity, but it's instructive to look at what it has accepted because these could be entry points for working with North Korea. For example, in 2019, North Korea accepted a recommendation that, quote, it grant immediate, free, and unimpeded access to international humanitarian organizations to provide assistance to the most vulnerable groups, including prisoners. I repeat, including prisoners. David Hawke points out that the reference to prisoners would doubtless not apply to those held in the secret camps, but it could be an entry point for humanitarian agencies once they're back on the ground to ask for access to re-education camps and other detention facilities, which also incarcerate many political prisoners without adequate food and medical care. Surely it's time to make this request a part of UN presence on the ground. Another opening for UN involvement is North Korea's acceptance of the recommendation that it familiarize its public with the international standards it's acceded to. UNESCO, UNICEF, the High Commissioner's Office should all step up. North Korea's public should also be made aware of the COI report and UN resolutions on human rights in North Korea. Further, North Korea noted for possible future implementation the recommendation that its population enjoy access to the internet, to international phone calls, and to foreign publications. Although not an acceptance, it was not an outright rejection. What becomes evident in David Hawk's report is that North Korea has made some gestures, albeit minimal, to cooperate with the UN, and these should be encouraged. Clearly, there are officials within the system who believe North Korea should move towards some internal reform. Or, as David has pointed out, they may see that non-cooperation produces pressure on the government, which could serve to undermine the legitimacy of the Kim family, whereas cooperation could enhance North Korea's reputation and make donors more likely to provide humanitarian and development aid. Of course, some North Korean officials simply fear prosecution. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has established a central information and evidence repository for eventual trials of North Korean officials responsible for crimes against humanity. In the face of accountability, North Korea can become transactional, looking for compromises, and also threatening. In 2014, North Korea suddenly invited the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights to pay a visit on the condition that all references to crimes against humanity and the International Criminal Court be removed from the General Assembly resolution. When this proved unsuccessful, the Special Rapporteur and member states stood their ground. North Korea's permanent representative subsequently warned of a new nuclear test. The following year, when the Security Council, the UN's most powerful body, met on International Human Rights Day to discuss North Korean human rights, Kim Jong-un publicly boasted of having a hydrogen bomb. Sometimes North Korea's threats succeed. South Korea, for example, has ceased co-sponsoring UN resolutions on human rights in North Korea. And in 2019, the United States prevented a Security Council meeting from taking place on human rights in North Korea, but opportunities and openings remain for pressing for reform. And it stands to reason that efforts should be made to try to engage the DPRK while also adopting strong resolutions, holding Security Council meetings, and continuing to prepare for trials. Thank you, David Hawk, for providing a needed roadmap for utilizing the mechanisms that exist at the UN and that could have ripple effects in North Korea over time.
Roberta, thank you so much. Terrific remarks. Let me also welcome our board member, Jack David, who has joined us, and also Sonia Bezerko, former commissioner and the free member, UN Commission of Input. She has also joined us for this program. And now please allow me to turn the discussion over to Ambassador Robert King, who served as Special Envoy for North Korean human rights issues from November 2009 until January 2017. We featured his book that should once again be a textbook for any student of Korean affairs and North Korean human rights. We did this last week. Ambassador King was at the very core, he was the very driving force of UN outreach and efforts to put together a coalition of like-minded UN member states that pressed very successfully for relevant UN action on North Korean human rights. There's a full chapter in his book on UN action on North Korean human rights. Once again, I highly recommend it. His book on the role of the U.S. Special Rapporteur, Ambassador King. I'm going to turn it over to you. Please go ahead, sir.
Thanks very much, Greg. I hate to start out by disagreeing with David. I think your report is a page turner, and I would really recommend it to everybody. Those who care about North Korea human rights, those who care about the United Nations, will find your report extremely interesting, extremely helpful, and I think very useful. So thank you for your efforts. The 50th report, the 20th anniversary of HRNK, it's a very appropriate way of acknowledging these particular events. The thing that I think you've hit on is the importance of the United Nations to North Korea. North Korea is very, very anxious to maintain its membership in the United Nations. For a country that claims to represent all of Korea and has a South Korea claiming to represent all of Korea and all of the citizens of those two areas, the United Nations is extremely important for the legitimacy of North Korea. South Korea has done very well on its own, thank you. North Korea has not, and the UN is very important. And for that reason, I think we have an advantage in terms of pressing North Korea in the United Nations. This is one of the international forums where North Korea is given recognition as a full member, as a full state. But the contrast with South Korea is very dramatic. It's important for North Korea to be able to be treated as a fully participating, independent state. And one of the things that the human rights activity has done has pressed North Korea to make some progress. The progress, as we've mentioned, has been minimal, but there has been progress. We've talked about the persons with disabilities. The fact that North Korea is now at least engaging on the Universal Periodic Review, is responding to questions, are all helpful and positive signs. And I think we need to make sure that we continue that effort. From the point of view of the United States, having North Korea in the United Nations and being able to talk about North Korea's human rights record in the United Nations is extremely important. It's not just the United States that's pressing North Korea on human rights questions. It's the United Nations. It's many other countries. And while Japan has faded in and out a couple of times in the last few years, South Korea has been less active than it was earlier. The United States was not a participant in the UN Human Rights Council. Nonetheless, other countries have continued that effort. And this is not just the United States pressing North Korea. It's the world pressing North Korea. And it's extremely important that we continue that effort, that we continue to do that. One of the things that I was particularly interested in was the effort to discuss North Korea in the UN Security Council. That was one of the very important steps that we were able to make, thanks to the leadership of Samantha Powers and others after the adoption of the Commission of Inquiry report. In December 2020, after having had a couple of years when North Korea was not discussed in the UN Security Council, the discussion did take place. It took place under slightly different rules because of the COVID pandemic, but nonetheless, the European Union, led by Germany, led the effort to hold that discussion in New York. The United States, this was in the waning hours of the Trump administration, the United States participated, although it had blocked the holding of such a discussion in the Security Council the previous year. The United States was there and participated as well. It's helpful to have Germany and the European Union, Japan, other countries taking a strong role on North Korea human rights. And the United Nations provides the vehicle, the opportunity, the means for doing that. There are a number of other things I could say. We've not given participants in this conference an opportunity to ask questions. So I'm going to say, David, thank you for what you've done. You've made another significant, important contribution to North Korean human rights. And I look forward to seeing the impact of what it has on what's being done in New York. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador King. We're now going to move over to the question and answer. After great questions from our board member, Jack David. I'm going to take a shot at the first one, David. Was the plan for distribution of David's report, especially the UN? Under COVID, we faced very tough, very strict travel restrictions. However, we took this opportunity to liaise and network with UN agencies, UN member states, also to build transatlantic bridges with the European Union and like-minded states on the other side of the pond. We have established and reinforced these relationships through electronic mail and video conferencing. The next step will be to disseminate David's report. We have plans to seek support for conferences in New York City, in Geneva, and truly David's report is going to be a cornerstone of these outreach efforts to resuscitate, of course, that alliance of coalition of like-minded UN member states that all of our panelists have mentioned today. The next question from Jack is, and I will direct this to, let me direct this to David. Which countries now have the most leverage on Pyongyang? But I'll also invite Ambassador King and Roberta to comment on this if they have thoughts. So again, which countries now have the most leverage on Pyongyang?
A hard question. The first country that comes to mind is obviously China, but even China's leverage is limited. China has been encouraging North Korea to take the path it took toward reform and opening. China's been encouraging North Korea to do that for 20 years, and so far the North Koreans don't and won't. But I think if you're talking about anything in the security area, China's extremely important, and it's whether it's sanctions enforcement or trade, it's really a question of what China will say and do. So, China's at the top of the list, and I think whomever is second is very far down.
And let me say that the question came from another Jack, from Jack Rendler, founding board member of HRNK. Sorry about that, Jack. Ambassador King, co-vice chair Cohen, any thoughts on this?
I agree with David. Basically, China has more influence than most, but still very little because of the way North Korea responds. South Korea has considerable influence, but hard to tell whether it has influence in these areas. And certainly what the South Korean government chooses to do is a function more of its politics than what's right. The US and the EU have played an important role. And I think those countries will continue to put pressure on North Korea on the human rights issues, and I think they should. The difficulty with North Korea is nobody has a lot of influence with North Korea.
Thank you, Bob. Roberta? Very much. David, this is a question for you from one of our, elders and the founder of the human rights movement, great supporter, really. Mr. Nam Shinu is very happy to see you, has a very blunt question. Who's worse, Kim Jong-un or Moon Jae-in?
Oh, please. Kim Jong-un wins that easily, hands down.
Following up on that, I have a question from our colleague Michael Maya at the International Bar Association. Michael wonders if the panelists could comment on the wisdom of the Moon administration's decision to mute civil society's discourse and activities on North Korean human rights. Why is the Moon government not using the United Nations and other fora to bring greater attention to the human rights violations to which the North Korean regime is subjecting their brothers and sisters in the North? I'm going to go to David, Roberta, and then Bob. David, you're up first.
Answering that question would take an entire program on its own. It really, as far as I can understand it, goes back to debates in South Korea during the Park military dictatorship, in which he said, first reunification and then democracy. And the progressives said, no, first democracy in South Korea, then unification, then democracy in North Korea. That was their order. They achieved, after considerable struggle for a decade or more, the democratization of South Korea. But the progressive idea, for the most part, remains that democracy, human rights, the rule of law in North Korea comes only after what they used to, and some still do, call it reunification. But what they're basically talking about is reconciliation and peaceful coexistence and communication, cooperation between the two existing Korean kingdoms. So the progressives want to wait until there is peaceful coexistence between the two Korea kingdoms on the peninsula before raising issues about the democracy, human rights, the rule of law in North Korea. So until that peaceful coexistence comes about, if North Korea wants to have prison camps, if they want to have public executions, if they want to punish North Koreans for enjoying South Korean movies or K-pop, that's too bad. And that's, as I understand it, the basic position of the Moon administration and where it comes from. And I don't think it's likely to change.
David, if they're kingdoms, we know who the king of North Korea is, then who is the king of South Korea?
Oh, I'll pass.
We'll move on to Roberta. Roberta, please.
I would just add that what we have been seeing is a desire on the part of South Korea to have reconciliation, have some sort of agreement. President Moon has kind of staked his reputation on this. His term is ending not that long from now, but he wants an agreement. And what he decided to compromise on, among other things, is North Korea's human rights record. I can never see how anyone in South Korea can look to reconciliation with a country that relies on political prison camps, public executions, a dictatorial system, a controlled economy, how one can reconcile with a country like that, it's really not seeing, it's not really very possible, overlooking that fact, overlooking the human rights situation, the nature of that regime. And this is extended into United Nations as well. I've mentioned when I spoke that South Korea has decided not to co-sponsor resolutions on human rights in North Korea. That's a very unfortunate decision. Perhaps they'll turn back. They did have an agreement with the United States recently, some sort of joint statement that talks about working lockstep with the United States on this question of human rights in North Korea, but we haven't seen that yet. Human rights is treated as if it were an obstacle to peace. That's the North Korean line. That's what South Korea is working from. And if North Korea doesn't want resolutions at the United Nations co-sponsored by South Korea, if North Korea doesn't want organizations within South Korea that are composed of sector groups who try to get information into the North, they don't want those organizations to function. They make it known, they threaten. They did blow up the joint office in Kaesong. And the South Korean administration has somehow chosen, in the interests of what they consider peace, reconciliation, bringing them together, having an agreement, has decided that this is the issue you can put aside. That's at least what I see. And it isn't. It isn't, and I think it becomes clearer and clearer every day.
Thank you, Roberta. Bob, any thoughts on this?
Just one quick thought. South Korea has taken the point of view that unification has got to take precedence, and so we'll deal with human rights later. A lot of the people who are focused on nuclear security in the United States have taken the point of view that, we're going to ignore human rights until we get North Korea to denuclearize. And once they've denuclearized, then we'll be in a position to be able to deal with human rights. I would argue the exact opposite. If we don't make progress on human rights, we're never going to make progress on unification of North and South Korea. We're not going to make progress on denuclearization unless there's some way that people of North Korea have an opportunity to have a voice and the ability to know what's going on in terms of these issues that affect them. It's going to be very hard to put pressure on that government to make the decisions that will lead towards denuclearization and towards reunification of Korea to the benefit of the Korean people. So I would turn it on its head.
Thank you very much. We have 4 questions pending. I'm going to bundle them together and direct them to different panelists. So David, for you, one question from our own Michelle Dang, HRNK. Given that the imposition of human rights accountability might come at the expense of the North Korean regime's survival, how should the United Nations strategically push for engagement with North Korea on a 2-track approach? Question number 1. The next one comes from Cord Robinson, our good friend. So basically, he is asking if there is any evidence that our own Biden administration, EU governments, other state or non-state actors have any new ideas about meaningful engagement and change. So are there, David, any new ideas for meaningful engagement and change? Bob, I'm going to direct this one to you. It comes from Jillian Workman. We see a sharp rise in populist and far-right leaders today. The most recent example, according to Gillian, being Naftali's election in Israel. What does this mean for global relations with North Korea? Will we see a more gradual acceptance of North Korea's abuses? The final question goes to you, Roberta. It comes from Orson Mazel. Has South Korea welcomed any refugees from North Korea during COVID-19? Is there a way the UN could help rescue refugees while North Korea is so closed during the pandemic? Apologies for going into overtime, and thank you for generously sharing your time. The audience, David, we'll go to you first.
Court's question. I don't know. I mean, the fact is, because of COVID, communications are, and travel is limited. There's telephone calls, emails, Zoom calls are really not a substitute for actually sitting down and discussing matters in some detail. So my answer is not to my knowledge, but I don't know. It's just like, the UN meetings have been happening, some of them by Zoom. So you don't have the normal discussions in the cafeterias and the hallways that you do when people are meeting in person. So there's much less cross-fertilization of ideas, which I hope that period is coming to an end. And so if there are some new ideas, they can be examined, considered, and so on. I didn't understand the premises of the first question.
So can the United Nations pursue a two-track approach, security issues and human rights? How should the United Nations strategically push for North Korean engagement based on this two-track approach? Nukes and missiles on the one hand and human rights on the other.
It's like walking and chewing gum at the same time. The UN has its own procedures and mechanisms for proceeding if there's the political will, and those can happen or not depending on the agency of the participants and if they want to do it. On security matters, these are for the most part different people who are dealing with it, different departments. We don't know if negotiations will resume. I think the North Koreans want indication that the US is putting more on the table than happened in Hanoi or Stockholm. I think the State Department, White House, is looking for indications that the North Koreans might be more forthcoming. So there's diplomatic signaling going on, and they may or may not get to opening negotiations. And once they do, the negotiations might well fail over matters related to verification or basic disagreements, fundamental disagreements, before they ever get to the point in talks where human rights issues could be taken up but I do not believe they're incompatible. If you talk to the former U.S. negotiators with North Korea, to a person, almost they say that if the negotiations are going well, human rights issues can be raised with the North Koreans. And actually, the North Korean negotiators say the same thing. When asked about human rights, they say it's down the road. That could mean it's forever down the road, but it could also mean if they are getting some of the concessions that they're looking for, they may be willing to discuss human rights issues at the forums for security discussions. You had a structure for that in the six-party talks, and if they ever got to the third stage, the areas of those negotiations where human rights issues would naturally come up are also present in the Singapore Agreement. But whether or not they'll get far enough down the road to get to any of that, is above my pay grade.
Thank you, David. We'll go to Ambassador King for the next question. First, the question about the sharp rise in populist and far-right leaders today and impacts on North Korea. Will you see a more gradual acceptance of North Korea's abuses?
This is a little complicated. The example of Israel is probably inappropriate because I would argue that in some ways what happened in Israel was very encouraging because you had a coalition of the far right and the far left to take out other far right. With North Korea, my sense is it's a much more complicated kind of problem. The world in which North Korea operates is largely dominated by China because China is its largest, closest neighbor and also its largest supporter. And what we see going on in China does not raise positive expectations in terms of what might be happening with regard to North Korea. I think we're finding the world today is becoming a place where relationships are much more sharply focused and differences are more sharply handled. And I think the North Koreans are likely to benefit from that because they benefit from noise and distraction. And I think, unfortunately, the North Koreans are moving in that direction. They're going to continue to do what they've been doing. I think North Korea is in greater difficulty than it's willing to admit. The economy is not functioning well. The pandemic has taken a heavy toll on North Korea. And, I think there are some real questions about the long-term stability of North Korea, depending on how things move from where they are right now. So I'm not terribly good at prognostication. So I'll say North Korea is going to continue to be a major problem, a major issue in that region. And it's going to be a major problem for human rights because it continues to be one of the worst human rights violators. I think we have our work cut out for us. I think it's going to be a tough time ahead.
Rob, thank you very much. And Roberta, the last actually questions will go to you. There is the one about the admission of refugees under COVID-19. And then I'm going to take one final question from Grace Kong. I'll direct that to you as well. She's asking, during South Africa's apartheid, the UN General Assembly denied the credentials of South African representatives. Should the same model be applied to North Korea? Of course, there are parallels between apartheid and Song Boon. There are human rights violations. So would there be value in having states just discuss the possibility of banning participation of North Korean officials in General Assembly? in the UN General Assembly. Would it make sense to adopt such an approach, perhaps in an effort to undermine the legitimacy of a regime that's committing crimes against humanity?
On the refugee question first, one of the very unusual consequences of COVID-19 and the closed border between North Korea and China is that North Koreans who managed to flee the country and go to China and have been arrested by China, China usually forcibly repatriates the North Koreans, and they are subjected then to beatings and arrest and torture. And this has been a longstanding and terrible problem at the border. But under COVID-19, North Korea is not accepting back the North Koreans that China is forcibly repatriating. So China has, in its detention facilities, I don't know how many North Koreans. There wouldn't be a lot because of these draconian border measures, but those particular North Koreans should go and probably want to go to South Korea. What then should be done about that? It's an opportunity to save their lives, really, and bring them to the South. Has South Korea become involved in negotiations with China to do this? Has the UN? Someone asked before about which country has the most leverage with North Korea, and the country that was identified was China. But I think perhaps an even more important question is who has leverage with China? In this particular case, the Secretary General, the UN, he has good offices. And Antonio Guterres used to be the High Commissioner for Refugees. He has good offices, and he could, and he's been asked to by various advocates outside the building to step up and try to make some sort of arrangement to bring North Koreans in China to South Korea, unless someone doesn't want to go. Has he done this? Well, not that I'm aware of. And I would say that he would like to become Secretary General again. And an important state in that would be China. So to what extent is his own inclination, because he was a very strong supporter when he was High Commissioner for Refugees of doing something for the North Koreans that were in China and were to be forcibly repatriated. So his own instincts on this issue would be on the side of those in favor of rescuing these North Koreans. But what is the political situation? And which agency, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, ought to be doing something, ought to have this on its agenda with China. But if you look at the press releases, you will see that China has been contributing a lot of money, a lot of resources to refugee issues on a worldwide basis. And the UNHCR, which is cash strapped at different times, is welcoming this. So the question of leverage with China is to me the real question. But I think that everyone in the advocacy world should do as much as they can to try to get China to agree to have these North Koreans go to South Korea and have and be rescued. If the argument comes, well, that will open the door to more, it really won't, because right now, under COVID, the borders are quite closed. And I really do hope, and I would personally appeal And I know Suzanne Schulte is in the audience, and she's been a powerhouse behind this. And the appeal would be to the South Korean government, to President Moon, to do something. South Korean government used to help in these kinds of cases. The extent to which they're doing that now is not clear. There are very few coming into the country. I read that there are maybe some 50 people, I don't know, in the first 6 months of the year that have gotten to South Korea. But to have a diplomatic arrangement here would be very important, to have the UN involved and also to have the South Korean government involved. With regard to the question about the credentials of South Korea and, not South Korea, South Africa, and whether this would apply to North Korea, one of the pressure points that could be, and a Council on Foreign Relations report actually put this on the table a number of years ago, one of the pressure points on North Korea could be that it wouldn't be suspended from the organization, it wouldn't be expelled from the organization, it would be suspended from General Assembly participation or votes. And that this could be on a yearly basis, so that if there is progress in the human rights area, then the credentials are restored immediately. If there is no progress, then they are forfeiting their right to be in the General Assembly, and that they have not cooperated sufficiently with the UN, that they are committing crimes against humanity. So this is more or less what the proposal is. It certainly doesn't go along with the idea of engagement, because if they are suspended from the General Assembly, then the engagement would be something that would be very hard to reconcile with that. It is an idea, I think, to keep somewhere, because it is a strong pressure point on North Korea. North Korea has responded to pressure. The COI report, as David's report shows, that report led to a number of steps on the part of North Korea to cooperate with the UN in some way. And accountability is really the issue that unnerves and unsettles North Korea. And with that idea, that's what generally presses them to either try to cooperate or, I mentioned before, to threaten, but they react to that. And they would react to an idea like this. I think it should be kept on the side. But right now, the question of engagement and trying to move North Korea forward so that it actually takes some steps that might help its own citizens, this is really what we are looking at. And those steps, which are very hard to identify, and especially during the COVID when engagement is almost impossible, but there can still be engagement with that government. And so I think we have to work out engagement, but in the background, I think it has to be very clear that at the same time, the international community and the United States in particular are going to support the pursuit of accountability and Security Council meetings and General Assembly resolutions to try to press North Korea to listen and take some steps. And at the same time, there'll be a willingness to engage and to speak with them and to discuss with them how to move forward and to be willing to get involved in all the mechanisms that the UN has to try to actually benefit North Korea. So these are complicated questions, as Bob King says, but I think the general view has been a two-track approach, and I think that the suspension track is one that can be out there too, but it doesn't look very, I don't think it would work well right this minute.
Roberta, thank you very much. Suzanne Schulte, co-vice chair of the board, says that September the 24th is, of course, International Save North Korean Refugees Day, when the North Korea Freedom Coalition delivers petitions, holds vigils, in front of Chinese embassies and consulates. Suzanne is seriously considering switching this to South Korean embassies and consulates if they do not save these refugees soon. Bob and David, with 1,000 apologies, I'm going to do a final lightning round. I have two great questions. I apologize. I know we're over time. I failed you as a moderator. David, this one comes from Professor Sandra Fahey at Sophia University. Is there any way that the DPRK government can exist in its current form and also respect human rights? Bob, Ambassador King, this one comes from our own, Do-Hyun Kim, from one of the members of our team. What options are there for the United Nations or the United States to move China to follow the rules and laws of the international community in relations with North Korea? And these are the final questions, I promise you. David, please go ahead.
Well, I would certainly hope so, because if that's not the case, what are we doing?
Terrific. Thank you. Bob?
Moving China to follow human rights issues in North Korea and to make a positive contribution. You know, we're dealing with China on a lot of problems. And when you look at what China is doing in its own territory, in Xinjiang, what it's done in Hong Kong, what it's trying to do in Taiwan, you know, those are fairly major issues. And to try to throw on top of that, trying to get the Chinese to do something on North Korea human rights is probably a bridge too far. I think the future of what happens in North Korea and what happens in Asia is going to be heavily dependent on how we deal with China. And how we deal with China will not only impact its 1.4 billion people, but it will also have an impact on the 25 million in North Korea. And depending on how that relationship between the rest of the world and China plays out is going to have a very big impact. Doesn't mean that North Korea is something we should ignore or forget about. We need to continue and we need to make an effort there. But China is not the key to the problem. Thanks so much. It was a great session. And David, thank you for your book. It's wonderful to have that information, to have it put together.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David, for your 6th report, HRNK's 50th, Co-Chair Emeritus Roberta, Cohen, Ambassador King. And as highlighted in David's acknowledgement section, I would also like to thank my colleagues, Rosa Park, Amanda Mortwood, Raymond Ha for their contributions to the report, as well as Roberta, Professor Steph Haggard, Ambassador Chong-Hoon Lee in South Korea, and Selma Lee in South Korea, and also other members of our team who have contributed to this extraordinarily important project: Brian Wild, June Kim, Benjamin Fu, Timothy Gu, Sophia Pepin, Eric Ryu, Scott Cho, and David Shaw, and of course, most importantly, Lady Hawk, Joan Libby Hawk, for her support and contributions, as David would agree, I'm sure. So thank you so much to all panelists for a terrific event. Again, my profuse apologies for going into overtime. And happy 4th of July. Happy birthday, America. Many blessings and best and warmest wishes to all of you and your families. Thank you. Please stay tuned for the next HRNK report release, which will be coming your way soon. Thank you and happy 4th.